Every year, the ACMS board selects one of its members as its Physician of the Year nominations by you, the members. Honorees exemplify the best ideals and aspirations of our profession by being active in the Ada County Medical Society and broader community, displaying outstanding professionalism behavior, standing out among physicians in the community, acting as a mentor to other physicians, promoting the advancement of patient care and new technology, and actively supporting physician issues at the local, state, and national levels. Tonight, we have invited Dr. Jessica Kroll to introduce our 2023 Physician of the Year honoree, Dr. Lauren Miller.
Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. All right, Dr. Lauren Miller. So Dr. Lauren Miller, she is a maternal fetal medicine specialist at St. Luke's, which means she specializes in patients experiencing pregnancy complications. Under her leadership, she has spearheaded the Idaho Coalition for Safe Reproductive Health Care. Last year, in response to the state laws that took effect after the Supreme Court did the Dobbs versus Jackson decision, the coalition has worked on revising state laws that criminalize evidence-based medicine for pregnant patients. They advocated for exceptions for mother's life, mental health, life-limiting fetal complications, and victims of rape and incest. They have fought against the affirmative defense standard, which means that you're guilty until proven innocent, which was repealed by the Idaho State Legislature this year. Over the past year, Dr. Miller and other members of this coalition have appeared on national news, interviews, and news programs. They've spoken to a wide variety of audiences on this and helped communicate issues in the medical community. They have raised awareness to the public and Idaho legislature about how laws negatively impact safe and timely medical care and the integrity of the physician workforce. In today's political divide, discussing such charged issues in it's a rather daunting task. However, Dr. Miller has navigated this with incredible professionalism, poise, grace, and the ability to steer the discussion back to the patient. She has exemplified the central reason why we all practice medicine and how to bring people together on these challenging issues for the common goal of providing the best care for our patients. Now, I'd like to just share one story about her. Just one story. This is hard because I'm a hand talker. I need my hands. This is not working for me. So I'm going to share one story. So during the annual conference up in Sun Valley at the IMA House of Delegates, they do like this cocktail reception. Everyone goes and does the thing. And I see her at the thing. I say, oh, so what'd you do today? What did you do? And she said, oh, I hiked Pioneer Cabin. Okay, sounds good. Okay, let me tell you about Pioneer Cabin. Okay, so it's a hike. It's an 8-mile hike. It's a 2,500 elevation foot gain, and there's a lot of up. It is an uphill battle. She also did it with a 3-year-old and a 1st grader, alone. Okay, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I would never do that. So she tells me that she's like, yeah, I had to hike Pioneer Cabin with my kids, and I thought to myself, holy smokes. So I asked her, I said, so how did it go? Huh? Like, did you make it? Tell me, did you make it? Were there meltdowns? Like, I was just expecting to hear like this horrible story. And she's like, no, we made it. As if it was good. And I think she enjoyed it. That was like the crazy part. I think she actually enjoyed this hike. So I'm thinking to myself like, oh my goodness. So if you've never done the hike, when you go up to Sun Valley, you should do it. And when you get to the top, there's a cabin and it says the higher you get, the higher you get. You get to the top. I don't know many other people that would do that. And this is an example of the kind of person she is. A task that seems so daunting, sometimes challenging, sometimes even impossible, she's willing to approach and to even accomplish. Thank you, Dr. Miller, for helping elevate our community, bringing us together, getting us all to the table with such grace, such class, and unity. Thank you.
So where's Steve? Is this on? Is this working? So Steve said I could take whatever amount of time I wanted to come up and talk, but he emailed me this like yesterday. And as as many of you know, I am leaving the state of Idaho, so I'm busy trying to find a house in another state, which is making this all very, very bittersweet. So I'm going to kind of keep this short and sweet. The fight is not over here. We have a ton of work to do. I'm going to be coming for everyone's money to try to raise money to make a difference in the state through the Coalition for Safe Reproductive Health Care. This fight's not over. We have a ton of work to do in the years to come. This isn't just an Idaho fight, right? This is a national fight. This is for reproductive autonomy. It's for safe health care. We've seen in our state the fight trickle on now to care for our teens, for our transgender teens. Right? We're being attacked from all sides as healthcare professionals, being charged as felons for providing evidence-based healthcare. And that's the word that we've already heard tonight, right? Evidence-based healthcare. That's what we're here to do. And this medical society has been fully behind evidence-based healthcare. And that is really what I think we need to bring to the table in this next year, is focusing on that. Let's take the A word out of this, right? We don't need to say the A word, right? It's evidence-based healthcare. And that's what I want to see change across the country, what I want to see change here. And that's the battle that we've been in for this past year. As a maternal fetal medicine physician, we're at the front lines of the risk to take on here as potentially being felons looking to Stacy, and one of my partners, Dr. Lee, he might have had to leave early, is here as well. We need to make this fight bigger than us that are at most risk, right? It's going to take all of us. It's going to take family medicine physicians, ER physicians, internists, surgeons, people who might be remote, like they don't have a risk of going to jail for treating their patients. It's going to take all of us coming together to say, this is not right. We know how to prevent death, right? Our goal is to provide health and promote the health of our patients, not just to prevent somebody from dying at the end of the day. And that's what we all need to advocate for all of our patients. So there is much work to be done. I will still be fighting from Colorado. I'm not going to cry up here. I'm going to miss Idaho tremendously. And I greatly appreciate the support.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Let's do one more round. Thank you. Idaho has lost a great physician when you moved, so thank you for your care, and your patients will miss you. And Dr. Miller, ACMS will be sending a contribution to $500 to Terry Riley Health Services in your honor at your designation. Thank you for that too. All right, at this time, I get to introduce you to Dr. Deb Roman, our president-elect, to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Robin?
Hi, everyone. I also want to thank Dr. Miller. And that just about brought tears to my eyes that so many people in our community wanted to stand up and applaud that work. So thank you for that. And thank you for everyone else who's doing that work as well. So I want to introduce Jay Baruch, who is an emergency room physician. He's a writer. He's also a medical educator and an accidental academic. And I mentioned this morning that he has to explain to you what that means. He's the professor and director of medical humanities and bioethics scholarly concentration at the Alpert Medical School of Brown University in Rhode Island. Excuse me. His interdisciplinary work evolved in response to uncertainty in clinical practice, which requires creativity as a clinical skill, and physicians who think more like writers and artists. Last year, he published Tornado of Life, A Doctor's Tale of Constraints and Creativity in the ER, and he authored 2 award-winning short fiction collections, What's Left Out, and 14 stories, Doctors, Patients, and Other Strangers. I just want to say that Jay met with our Vitality Committee a couple of times because he really wanted to be sure that he kind of got to know our community. What were the issues that we find important, that we really want to work on? And that was really amazing. And he did that a couple of times so that he could bring a workshop this morning and a presentation tonight that would hopefully be useful to us. The presentation or the workshop this morning was awesome. It was an amazing experience where we got to practice something called narrative medicine, where we actually were writing in response to prompts. And it was this powerful experience where so many things that might be in our minds and in our hearts, we could actually kind of leave on the paper and look at them, move them up out of our bodies a little bit, and then get different kinds of insights. So it was so beautiful that many of us have been talking about how we can integrate that in our community and offer that in more spaces for all of you. So Jay is, I haven't known him long, but I can tell you that what I do know is that he deeply cares about the medical community, and he doesn't really want to just bring something dogmatic to us. He wants to bring something that kind of inspires us to think, questions that we can consider, situations that we might want to discuss. So it's really a beautiful honor to have him here. And with that, I will let him talk with you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, that's okay. You all right? All right. First of all, thank you, Deb, for that introduction, and thank you for all the great work that you and everyone is doing here. Before I get distracted. Like I'll be straight. I get distracted. So I just want to get a few things out of the way. One is I want to congratulate Dr. Miller and everyone who's doing this important work. You know, my heart is breaking for you all, and I just want to say gratitude and strength. To Steve Reams and the Vitality Committee and the community that I just can't, who brought me out here, I just can't thank you enough. What happened today, this morning, during this workshop, was really a testimony to everyone who was here. It was really a testimony to everyone who was here, because I can like throw stuff out and I can get silence. You know, I can get like, you know, that 5-year-old like crossing your arms and go, did not happen. People really invested. And so what I'm going to do is I'm sort of going to walk you through a little bit of sort of my thinking about sort of moral distress. And you have to understand, I get distracted. I turn it on. All right. Is I have to come up with a couple of disclosure slides, right? So the obvious disclosure is, like, I have no conflict of interest. I have a lot of interesting conflicts, some of which I'll be talking about during this little presentation, and some of which, you know, I'd have to pay you like $200 for 50 minutes to hear all this stuff. So you're just going to get some of the conflicts. Secondly, it's, you know, this idea about moral injury and moral distress has really come from the military. We'll talk about this a little bit, but it really came up with came prominent in the nursing perspective. But if you look at the literature, it's involved nurses, respiratory therapists, social workers, chaplains, physicians, and yes, even administrators. So it encompasses also, if I use physician or if I use clinician, but I'm trying to encompass all healthcare workers. And what you might say, hey, Baruch, why aren't you saying healthcare workers? Because it just sounds so awkward. You know, it's a lot of syllables, you know, for me to handle. So like, just realize, but I'm meaning all you. Third is that I am an expert in nothing. I've been an ER doc for 30 years. I write, I'm a medical educator, and I've been doing this long enough to know that I'm an expert in nothing. But what I can share with you is that the struggles that I've had in trying to capture these experiences and share them with you, and hopefully in some way they will be meaningful. I've been trying to unpack some things that we don't necessarily talk about, and I've had the pleasure and sometimes the disgruntled results of publishing some of this back and getting feedback. But I want to share with you a quote from a poet, Stephen Dunn, when asked about like his motivation, his early motivation for writing. He goes, my early motivation for writing was that other people's versions of the experience didn't gel with my own. It was a gesture towards sanity to try to get the word right for myself. I've since learned that if you get it right for yourself, it often has resonance for others. And I think it's this idea of like just sharing my own struggles. It's not going to mean you're going to struggle that way. You're infinitely smarter and you have your own experiences, but hopefully you can maybe get some tips and get some ideas about how you could perhaps think through some situations. And if I can give you a different axis of understanding, that's all I can do. And I feel like when I'm teaching at my best, is that I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. I'm just giving you permission to be you. I'm giving you permission to think the way you normally would have thought, but for some reason there are some barriers. I also just want to recognize the fact that there is no map for caring for others. Like what we do is so meaningful and so profound, and distress is part of that, right? And oftentimes we have to find our own way through this, and sometimes we're not very good at acknowledging that. So hopefully I can give you share some of my experiences, and you can sort of chart your own map through this. Then last thing, yes, that's a turducken. And you might be going, why is there a picture of a turducken? First of all, it's the wrong season. And second of all, like, why a turducken? So for those people who don't know what a turducken is, it's an interesting creature, which is usually during Thanksgiving, where it's like you have a chicken stuffed into a duck, then stuffed into a turkey. First of all, it's a terrible thing to do to a chicken. It's also a terrible thing to do with a duck and do to a turkey. But anyway, that's what that is. And why am I having it there? Because it feels for me like it's a metaphor for medicine. You know, and it's a moral center stuffed inside of a business ethic, stuffed inside a political agenda. And at its core is a moral center. And I talked about that, and like I get a couple of chuckles. I think it's kind of funny, but I think it's wrong. I think the reason why it becomes a moral problem is not the fact that it's a turducken or the fact that medicine is at the moral center is at the center. It's the fact that it is at the center. However, in reality, the moral veneer is at the outside. And all the different interests are promoting it as a moral enterprise. We care, quality of care, we care for you, health with care. But in reality, we're all constrained by the political and business challenges. And in fact, it's claiming to be one thing when we all know it's being driven by other forces. I think it's why it's a moral problem. And that's just something that I sort of realized while preparing this talk for you all today. So I'm still sticking with the turducken, but I'm sort of interpreting differently. So what are going to be the pillars of understanding as we approach this issue? Is that there's going to be three pillars of understanding. You know, we have objectives, when I had objectives about sort of the apparent and less apparent challenges that we all face as sources of moral distress, perhaps how we can use narrative tools as a way to understand our situations more, and then how do we communicate and respond to moral distress and use what we've learned on a personal, interpersonal, organizational, and perhaps a societal level. But that's like the stage, like objectives. There's three pillars of understanding that I want you to sort of think through that I'm going to walk through in this talk. You know, so one is language. Is the fact that, like, what the hell is this thing called moral injury and moral distress in the first place? Like we sort of use the term, does the term actually do work for us that we actually should be doing? Because as you see, there actually truly isn't any one big understanding about what moral distress or moral injury is. So I have a sort of a healthy distrust of certain tools. I'm a little bit of a skeptic, you know. So I'm like, I don't know about wellness. Like I don't like the term wellness. You know, I know it's important. I know it's critical. I want to be well, but the idea about wellness as like this noun, this thing that's out there, I don't know. Same thing with moral distress and moral injury. I'm not quite certain. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, and I'll talk about that. Second thing is emotion. Like we don't realize that. Like what happens is the fact that we talk about moral distress as if it's like this thing in a bottle. It's a specimen bottle. It's like, oh, this is moral distress. This is moral injury. And I've been to enough humanities meetings over a couple of decades to hear really smart people talk about definitions and really tease it out. But reality, is everyone okay? But the thing is, like, it's not moral distress that we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on people who are suffering from moral distress. Like we forget about people. You know, and that means we have to think about the situations, and we have to think about context, and we forget about us, and we forget about emotion. Because as we'll see, emotion is a really important aspect of identifying it and responding to these challenges. And the last thing is vulnerability. Like, we're supposed to be vulnerable. Like, the most important thing is to sort of let our guard down. You know, to be vulnerable is to be exposed, is to reveal, is to be unprotected. You know, and we talk about the importance of being vulnerable. But I don't know about you all, but like, it's really hard being vulnerable. You know, and we learned that this morning. Like, there were some issues that people just didn't want to talk about, that people were writing furiously, but they just didn't want to talk about it, and I totally get it. There's one thing to say it's important to be vulnerable. It's another thing to actually be vulnerable, and we'll talk about that. So one area, so we have these big issues around moral distress, and my interest is, like, I'm not that smart enough to wrap my hands around those things. And what I often end up writing about are those small moments, like these things that just make me feel like I always write. Like I'm always writing, I'm always scribbling, and most of it is just lousy junk. It's like 95% of it, but that's the way, and it's my way of thinking. It's about writing. It's about thinking on the page. It's about creating that space. And so I had one situation that was truly, truly troubling to me for years. Was I work in Rhode Island at a level 1 trauma center, you know, de facto county hospital. We get a lot of people who are of unstable housing, a lot of people with substance use disorder. We have one of the highest uses in the country per capita. And I'm always faced when it's cold out, which is cold a lot, of like discharging, you know, someone who was intoxicated and homeless out into the street. And there's one particular patient, and there's a lot of patients like this person, Mr. Green, I'll call Mr. Green, who, you know, comes in several times a week, sometimes twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day. We've offered all kinds of services. He's burned a lot of bridges with us and with just the various different detox places and shelters and stuff that's not allowed back. And so there's 40 people, 45 people in the waiting room. And it's like 1 or 2 o'clock. And he's sober enough to leave. But it was such a freezing night. I was working an overnight shift. I'm coming in. It's one of those nights where I'm so grateful to be inside. Like just to walk from the car to the ER, I was like, oh, thank God. Like that, even just the terrible smell of the ER, I was like, oh, that's so great as long as it's warm. And yet I had to discharge. I had a choice. Like, do I discharge him or do I keep him here? The compassionate thing is to keep him of course, to keep him in the bed until morning. What's the big deal? Well, like there's challenges, medical challenges of like he's going to go into withdrawal, and then I have to, you know, then sedate him, give him medicine for withdrawal. That's going to, you know, make him tired. He's going to stay there even longer. There's also the fact that we had a terrible boarding problem, and it was like 45 people in the waiting room, and there was no one's getting beds, and people were waiting for 6-7 hours, and that bed became a compassionate resource. That became a scarce resource and a source of the trouble for my compassion. So when I've written about this, I felt like, why am I so angry? Like I get so angry with Mr. Green for putting me in that position. And I didn't know what I was doing. I felt awful. I couldn't send them home. I couldn't send them out, or not at home, send them out to the street. However, I also could not care about the people who were waiting in the emergency department when I'm not really doing much for him except keeping him out of the cold. So people talk about compassion, and they say, like, we don't have compassion. That healthcare providers need more compassion. But I realized that my problem when I was writing about it, when I started writing about this, it was about a boarding problem and the challenges that we face in the boarding problem. And then it was like being complicit with people who just don't want to take care of themselves and like get offered these short resources and then don't get better and burn their bridges. And it's like, well, they also have a very high mortality, unstable housing. They have a high mortality rate, like premature mortality. And then there's a mental health problem, so maybe it's a mental health issue, so how much does you control? So you get down this rabbit hole. The big issue, I realized, was the fact that the reason why I was so challenged by it was the fact that I was being forced to make a choice. I was forced to allocate my compassion. I had to, depending upon how you look at it, I could be compassionate to Mr. Green and keep him there, or I could be compassionate to the person in the waiting, to keep one of the 40 people in the waiting room and get them back. And depending upon what direction you were, where I was looking, it could only go in one direction. It was a zero-sum game. I couldn't be compassionate to both. And if something happened to Mr. Green, it would be like I would be on my head. If something happens to somebody in the waiting room because we missed something and they waited for 6 hours, it's on my head. And that idea about moral uncertainty, and depending upon what I did, I could be looked at as compassionate or not compassionate. So I wrote about this. I talked about compassion confusion. I had to make up a term. And I had people writing to me saying, "Hey, thank you so much for writing this. Thank you so much for writing this." And they were grateful, and I'm glad I wrote it. And then there were people who wrote, "You're a cold and heartless doctor. You're a terrible person." Usually, I can tell because the email, you terrible person. It's not subtle. Usually, it's more expletive than that. But you get what I understanding. So it's really, really challenging, and it's these really small moments. So is that moral injury? What is moral injury? I don't know. I didn't feel like I wrote about it, and to this day, I don't know if that counts as moral injury. I don't know. So moral injury and moral distress, it's been studied. There are a lot of different definitions. And so Jonathan Shea, who did some of those most seminal work and brought this term to our attention in his work with military personnel and veterans, said, it's a betrayal of what's right, either by a person in authority or oneself, and in a high-stakes situation. And then Litz et al., who's with the VA, and his colleagues followed up and did incredible empirical work, and said that it's an experience a potentially injurious event by perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning from the acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Okay. Right. Then we get Andrew Jameson, who was brought this to healthcare, talked about nurses in 1984, and he goes, "A nurse knows the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action." Then Wendy Dean and Simon Talbot, have done later work talking about moral injury. They go simultaneously knowing what care patients need, but being unable to provide it due to constraints that are beyond our control. So each of these things have parts of it, none of the definitions feel complete into itself, but each one of them, I think, highlights important things that are meaningful to me. The idea of stakes, even our small decisions can have high stakes, whether to discharge somebody in the middle of the night, high stakes. It's a transgression, and I love the idea about a transgression, but it's something that's a violation of something deeply sacred and important to us. Now, this is not like a little thing. This is like something that is so core to us And I think people this morning when we were doing the workshop realized like how we incorporate, how we identify our values, and realize when those are violated, really the core ones that are so we clinch onto are violated, it really sort of resonates, and the impact it is tremendous. The idea about constraints, which we'll talk more about, limitations, what are those constraints? And the idea about control or the lack thereof control. And as you see, a lot of people, there's some other definitions, but you know what to do. And as I said, I go, sometimes this idea about moral uncertainty, I don't know what to do. You know, and that itself is a moral challenge. So the problem with these definitions for me is that these definitions of moral distress actually leave me feeling distressed for problems that I just raised. The fact that it doesn't apply to all the situations that I have and I feel, and the fact that all I know is that I don't know if I fit any of those definitions. All I know is that I feel terrible. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. I find myself being short to colleagues. I find myself perhaps my relationships with patients or being less tolerant to patients. And I get angry. I mean, all during the COVID pandemic, you know, we were, at one point, you know, we were #1 per capita in the world, I think, a little roadie. And it was terrible. And I was just not, I was a shadow of myself. You know, and and those definitions didn't compute to that feeling I had. So what's amazing is that I've been an ER doc for 30 years. And I never really thought about the term emergency. It's really simple. Like, it's really amazing how you sort of what you contemplate. And this is a book by A Paradise Built in Hell, which is it's a fantastic book of essays by Rebecca Solnit, who talked about like 6 different disasters and the fact that how our response to disasters, how communities come together in disasters, and how some leaders actually take advantage of disasters. But in her first chapter, in her first essay, she talks about what emergency is. And I love this idea, especially to our discussion tonight. Because the word emergency comes from emerge, to rise out of. An emergency is a separation from the familiar, a sudden emergence into a new atmosphere, one that demands that we ourselves rise to the occasion. I love the idea of a separation from the familiar. Because if there's anything that we've all experienced over the last couple of years is that our familiar, our normal has become very abnormal. And we haven't returned back to that normal. We can't. It's impossible to do that. And we're in this new atmosphere. And I love the idea of an atmosphere. Because our sense of destabilization is so significant, yet we somehow are trying to still behave and still act in the ways that we always did. And then the one about what it means to rise to the occasion. Like, what does that mean to rise to the occasion, especially when we have trouble rising to the occasion, or when situations prevent us from rising to the occasion? And I think part of the challenge, and why I think this applies to moral injury and moral distress, is the fact that sometimes we can't rise to the occasion to the standard that we feel that we should. And what are the consequences of that? So there's been a lot of growing work on moral injury and moral distress, a lot of empirical work. You know, and I'm not going to go into that many details, but this was a great study by Reitel and colleagues, and it's basically a descriptive study. It's like, listen, what are some of the areas people identify coming out of the pandemic? There's some studies even before the pandemic that have to do with moral stress. What are the moral stressors in our work, which I think we all sort of recognize in some ways or another. You know, some have to do with patient care. You know, for example, during the pandemic, it was like, how do we balance patient care with provider safety, interpersonal, like hierarchy, team stuff, communication stuff. You know, being part of, being in a situation where you're expected to behave in a way that you're unable to, or having colleagues who are not responding in a way that, or to a standard that you want. Then organizational, which I think we're all aware of, which is like, policies and procedures, having this thing called an electronic medical record, which we have to somehow navigate, which sometimes is our friend and oftentimes is our foe. But there's 3 different stages. I don't want to go through that, but what happens is that one way seems to be a body of literature that says we're going to focus on sources of distress. And we're oftentimes aware of those sources because they either mean something to us or they don't mean something to us. Then they have moral distress scales and measurements, and Kolb and DeMello did this wonderful article in the American Journal of Bioethics, where she said, she took a really interesting examination of moral distress scales, and it's really important. Like I want to measure things. I think it's important to sort of measure things that helps identify, let us study things and realize that these are important tools to have in our tool belt. But she actually, and what I think is interesting is Dr. Kolb is actually an ICU doctor and bioethicist, and also just an amazing poet, which I think that all contributed to some of her insights in this article. And if you haven't read the American Journal of Bioethics, which I'm sure many of you have not read, but they have an interesting approach where they actually have a couple of sort of highlight articles, and they have a bunch of people responding to that, which I sort of love that form. But so people responded to this, and what they were saying is that it said 3 things, but I think it's interesting. Most of those scales, and the scales start from 2001. Corley and his colleagues, started having a moral distress scale. Then there was a revised moral distress scale. Then there was a moral distress scale for healthcare providers by Epstein, and there was something. So there's like 3 or 4 different versions of these things, and I think they're important in its own way, but they also predicate on questions. They ask certain questions, and they end up being subjective responses to these things. And what they were saying with this, what I think is really relevant, is one, like how do we know that the distress the person feels is moral distress? Right? Because what we do is incredibly powerful, and it's distressing on a daily basis. So how do we know when something sort of reaches over into moral distress? Secondly, how do we know whether someone actually has an assessment, has the facts of a particular situation? And so the example they use is like, let's say a nurse is upset with the doctor because of, they feel like there's being there's inappropriate care, end of life. They're doing a lot of unnecessary, what they perceive to be futile work on behalf of this patient. They might not be aware that maybe there was a change of goals in care, for example, or it could be vice versa with, the nurse having information that the doctor does not. And then the last thing is, she said that, what if moral distress might be actually an appropriate response as an engaged moral agent? We pathologize moral distress, but what if moral distress is actually something that some of us actually need to agree, because it means that we care, it means that we engage, it means that we care that our values there are values we hold on to, and that we actually are very sensitive to the fact that they are being breached. I thought it was really interesting. However, there's importance of moral distress scales. I think there are limitations, and we need to know when to use these tools. Then lastly, there's studies that sort of investigate the feelings, the emotions that people have around moral distress. Guilt, anxiety, sadness, self-blame, doubt, powerless, shame, unforgiveness, distrust, and isolation. All these things are really important. But what gets to me is they talk about these things, and I have a lot of these symptoms. Can we talk? I have a lot of these symptoms. However, like, how do I know necessarily that these symptoms are related to moral distress? It makes an assumption is that these people have these symptoms, have these feelings, have these emotions, but how do we know it's related to moral distress? So the scales themselves are sort of challenging and it's sort of interesting. But the thing is that, are we even aware of the emotions that we have? Are we aware of them? And what do I mean by that? It's that, like, I feel like if there's something that is discouraged in healthcare or denormalized in healthcare, is actually emotions. We don't look at emotions as a signal for sort of something's at stake. I had a resident who was like, got angry, to a consultant, a really wonderful resident. And they got off the phone, and I'm like, that's not you. You know, I go, what happened? And she goes, and she was apologizing, and I was like, no, I'm interested. Like, what happened that made you behave this way? Because we're like that. We're like that. We're not automaton. We care. There's no way that we can not be emotional, and have our emotions show. So how do we use emotions as a signal? As a signal that something's at stake, that something we care about is breached. And I feel that's a risk, I feel, when we don't pay attention to our emotions. And as we learn today, is that it's really hard to deal with our emotions. And also when we get emotional, especially in morally distressing situations, we are in that sympathetic tunnel. You know, and so when you have that emotions going, you look at things one way and it's your way. And it's really hard sometimes to look at a problem from a different situation or from the other person's perspective. So I feel it's really, really vital that we sort of normalize the role of emotions in our daily work. So we have these things, like we have these areas, we have doing the empirical work of like the sources of moral distress, and we think about the emotion, the role of emotions, then we have these scales. But I think at the core of it is we have experiences. And we have intense experiences. And I don't know, many of you know Linda Barry. She's a cartoonist and a graphic novelist and a wonderful teacher, quirky teacher, speaker about the role of creativity in general. And I had this great line. She goes, this thing I call my mind seems to be kind of like a landlord that doesn't really know its tenants. Right? Like how do we know our tenants? Like, what do we know? Do we really actually create the time and create the space and create the opportunities for us to really figure out what's going on in our head? And the fact that sometimes what's going on in our head is a signal that what goes on in our heart and in our belly. Because for me, as a writer, I got to tell you, I came to ethics because of my love of writing. And the reason why that is because I looked at ethics and clinical ethics as entering a situation at the high point of a story. When two different parties have different ideas and different concepts of what is, quote, the good, or what is, quote, the harm. You know, and how much fun is that to enter at this charged moment and to break it down? And I know enough philosophy to be dangerous, but really most of the time, these situations are handled by understanding the people involved and using narrative skills. You also said something which is really interesting, which I said this morning, which I feel applies to our work. You said, what is an experience? Is an experience something you have or something that has you? I feel like we get caught by these experiences. We don't pay attention. We push it down. We don't appreciate the impact of it all. And then she says something which I think is brilliant. Because what happens to an experience once it's been had is incredible. So simple. It's just in a graphic form. So the book is what it is, and you should get it. So I talk about my writing and the work I've done. And it's really the fact that moral distress, I feel, is fuels a narrative engine. You know, as something that sort of eats at me, and as people this morning learned, it's like it eats at me, and I write about it. When I write about it, I learn things that I never would have thought about. I pay attention differently. Like, what's the value of writing? Is the fact that it's not writing itself, it's thinking on the page. And when you move your pen across the page, you access parts of your brain. You also feel like you're getting stuff that's in your head and you're getting it out. And you find yourself realizing how hard it is to put language to an experience. One thing to have an experience, it's one thing to capture that experience, and it's another thing to put words to that experience. It's really hard, and I think the people this morning will attest to the fact that it's really hard. And what's hard about it, not the fact that writing is hard, though some editors in the room might say, yes, writing is very hard. It's the fact that it involves breaking down. It involves breaking down our defenses. And that involves going deeper. And we're so good at, we create all these fences around us, whether we realize it or not. And we have to go through those fences. the actor Anna Devere Smith, I don't know if some of you work, she's on tons of TV shows, but does incredible plays where she interviews people and then does these one acts that are extraordinary. And she said something about acting in her work on the stage, which I think just applies so profoundly to our work in medicine. And she says, we can learn a lot about a person in the very moment that language fails them. You know, so this morning, I was so taken as much by the great insights from the room than by where there were silences. Like because I felt like there were spaces that language just couldn't capture. You know, and we got to pay attention to those silences. So, as opposed to like evidence-based medicine, where all that great empirical, evolving empirical work and about moral distress and kind of captures experiences and these sources and scales, like that's too involved and involved with big brain people. I'm not a big brain person. I'm a small brain person, and as a small brain person, I think about things in a small way. And I just find there's so much power in such small moments. You know, moral distress is rooted in lives, not problems, small moments, not always big issues. And why that's important, because it allows you to get deep. It allows you to get small and deep. You create your parameters, and you really dissect this moment. And you sort of realize, as you do that, how these situations, how these things apply, and what's really at the heart of the problem. One of the biggest challenges that I had in writing, I'll share with you, was like, how do I get to the heart of a story? Like, how do I get, where do I work? Where do I talk around? What are those issues that are so critical that I talk around them? Like, what's at the heart of the story? And that involves a certain sort of vulnerability, which I didn't have at the time. But it's those small moments, and we can control those. An incredible sense of empowerment when you can sort of say, I feel like I understand that a little bit more. So why that's so difficult is, one is just what it expects of us, muscles and skills that we don't always practice. Two, it forces us to be vulnerable. We have to lower our defenses, which we're not very good at. And third is that when we're faced problems in medicine, what do? We look at the data. We go for what's the data? And sometimes I'm so fascinated that we look for numbers. Like we look up here for challenges. We look up here. We have challenges. We look up here, instead of like looking inward and saying, what questions should we be asking? You know, are there certain problems or certain challenges for which the data doesn't apply? And why that becomes a moral challenge is the fact that there are so many situations that we respond to, which there is no response in the data. There's no answer in the data. The best studies will tell you what to do with 10,000 patients, but they might not tell you what to do with that one patient before you at that particular moment in time. And I feel that sometimes what we do, or I do, is that you have a tendency to look for the familiar. So you try to find the things that you can solve, which also limits the questions that you're asking. So I think there's actually there are moral stakes in just the way we might inappropriately use evidence-based medicine. That's a different talk. This is an example of how to get really small. So moral distress, I think, defies scale. I mean, even the smallest decisions can be distressing, incredibly distressing. And so what I've managed to sort of embrace is the messiness. And we've got to meet and kind of embrace the messiness of medicine. And so, for example of this is treating pain. So I got into ethics in a legitimate way. I did a fellowship in medical ethics, and my project for this, the reason why I was a narrative approach to pain. But I felt like no matter this is 2001. I did my fellowship. I'd been out for several years. 2001, and I felt like no matter what I did, I felt wrong. If I gave somebody narcotics, I felt wrong. If I didn't give somebody narcotics, it felt wrong. I didn't know what. So that was my project. And so I spent like a year, like doing all the research on, opioid use, and I read everything. I had folders, like this is like the time of papers. I had folders and folders and folders, and I couldn't write. I had no answer for it, And this was during the time of oligoanalgesia and the importance of treating pain, and now we know from the Sacklers and all those studies that a lot of this stuff was sort of like had nefarious and disingenuous backing. However, I couldn't write about it. I had no answer. I had all the data. I couldn't write. I couldn't get the core problem. Then several years later, I had to get very small. And it's how I got it small was like I realized there was a situation in my practice that I hated, that made me miserable. I avoided these patients. I was not the nicest person. I was not me. It was me, but not me. And it was like someone comes in with dental pain. We had a lot of people came with dental pain because we had really lousy health dental coverage and not enough dentists for all the people who had terrible teeth. And then this guy came in, we'll call him Sonny, and I knew all the data. I knew all the data on sort of like substance use and abuse of opioids. But the problem is that in my practice, the data had faces. These faces had rotten teeth. And these rotten teeth caused these people a lot of pain. I had this one guy who's, coming with terrible dental pain, can't get in and trying to do his best to get into an appointment, doesn't have health insurance. And it's just miserable. Nothing works for him. All the blocks, all the stuff doesn't work. And everything, I was dealing with really sick patients, and I was so stuck with this one guy. I spent so much time with this one man about what I should give this guy a narcotic, And it's like, if I give him a narcotic, and he's using it for to feed an addiction, am I feeding his addiction? Am I sort of contributing to the pill economy? Will nurses think that I'm sort of soft on pain? I'm just giving them pain medicine, whatever. Or if I withhold pain medicine, am I being cruel? Am I being unfeeling? Will nurses think that I'm sort of like a hard doctor? I don't really care about patients. And it's pain, something that is so easily treated, where we have some things to treat. And I couldn't get my head around it. And I walked, when I wrote about it, I walked through the situation. And I thought that it was that was the issue. It was narcotic or not a narcotic. It wasn't. When I wrote about it, I realized that really at the core of it all, that pain is a subjective experience. And at the heart of it is do I believe what this man is telling me? Do I trust him? And that's a terrible feeling to have. I really don't trust you, or I do trust you. And then the more I wrote about it, I go, that's not it either. I think what it really is the fact that if you come to the ER in pain, and you go home in pain, that is the most basic thing that I can respond to is someone's pain. And yet I let you go home, you're still in pain. And what does that say about me, my integrity as an individual? How can I call myself a doctor if you came in with something simple that I could respond to, and you go home the same exact state? So we talk about story, this idea about characters, we're all characters in these narratives and these stories. And what I think is interesting to how it pertains to this discussion is that the word ethics has the same root as ethos, which is the Greek word for character. And so for the Greeks, character is a function of the choices we make and the actions that result from those choices. So what we do, the actions we make, says a lot about who we are as people. And that's what's sort of common when you see the literature about moral injury and moral distress, is this idea that it's a violation of our moral integrity. It's not just about being distressed, it's actually a gradual erosion of our identity. And that's serious stuff. The stakes are pretty high. Stories rest on trouble. But all good stories have is trouble. And stories live in the gap between what was expected to happen and what ends up happening. And that's our daily lives. Like medicine lives in that expectation gap. That's where we live. So how do we respond? Like how we respond, like that's what keeps us turning the page when reading a book. When you are watching a movie and you give up, it's like, I know what's going to happen. So how do we navigate that space between what is supposed to happen and what happened? And I feel like that, we can have lots of fancy language about moral injury and moral distress, but that's really what the crux of the matter is. It's like we know what's supposed to happen, we have an idea about it, or we think we do, and we can't act. We're limited. The idea about point of view is important in writing. We saw that. And we saw that today after we talked about sort of particular situations, writing about it from somebody else's perspective and someone else's point of view, from the other person's point of view. That's really hard to do. That requires a movement that would not necessarily, when you're in the moment, you're capable of doing. And it's really challenging, and it's a muscle. It's a muscle you have to learn to practice and use. And then telling stories is an act of vulnerability. I tell students when I'm teaching, I go, how many of you have done like poetry slams or like give readings or whatever they're writing, and some of them have done that. And I go, how does it feel? They're terrifying. There's something about saying what's important to you and being on a stage that's incredibly terrifying, being vulnerable and exposing yourself and talking about what you're feeling. And it's really hard. And it's really hard to do it when you're responding in crisis. It's really hard to be vulnerable when all of a sudden you're facing really big challenges. So we have to honor vulnerability in our work. We have to create the conditions, those spaces where vulnerability can be treated with respect, with dignity, with honesty, because we can't say we're going to try to respond to moral injury and moral distress without recognizing that in order to do that, people have to be able to communicate and talk to each other, and that requires vulnerability. So when we were talking about big issues and big challenges in medicine, the last piece I'm going to talk about is I talked about the challenge that we had in getting blankets out to patients. And the problem is the fact that we had like 60, 70, 80 people in our waiting room. And people were not going anywhere. We were almost fully boarded. I work at a huge ER. We have, 80 beds, 70 beds. At night, maybe we were down to whatever, a little bit less than that, but everything was full boarded for days. This is during COVID. But people just wanted a blanket. And I go out to our triage area from an overnight shift, and the nurse is crying. Because someone was really upset they couldn't get a blanket. And the nurse wanted to give a blanket. She desperately wanted to give a blanket. However, when they've done that before, the triage nurses, it's like all of a sudden everyone wants to come in and get a blanket. And then you don't know who to say no to, and family members come up with a blanket, and then like blankets walk. And it's such a fundamental thing. Like we should be able to be like, you're waiting to give you a blanket. And then people got angry, and then people became violent during one time. And it became this thing, so it was better just to say no. And when I took care of this one particular woman, she was totally fine with the unconscionable weight, but she couldn't get her head around. She couldn't understand why she couldn't get a blanket. I felt like we were in that time. This is like during COVID. We were making all these little these movements away from our standard of and this wasn't like end of life issues. This was a blanket, a simple blanket. And her name was Mrs. J. And so this is sort of I wrote a little small passage of that. They said, I hold on to my moment with Mrs. J because I'm discovering that I'm losing the part of me once troubled by what it meant not to give a cold patient a blanket. I come to feel so overwhelmed and powerless by everything I can't do that I've erected a shameful line of self-defense. I become emotionally vacant. Sometimes it's easier to pretend I don't see the needy faces and walk blindly past a swell of moaning patients waiting for hours and hours in hallways. I pretend I don't hear the frail man with dementia screaming, "Doctor, doctor." I speed by the otherwise well-appearing silver-haired woman who fell and quietly lies on a stretcher in pain because the stiff neck collar immobilizing her cervical spine is digging into her chin. I walk by because I'm busy with other patients, because I don't want to give the impression that I'll be their doctor when there are many patients ahead of them, because I know that stopping to care for one person can precipitate other worthy calls for my attention. I walk by enough times, and this protective line of defense becomes who I am. What really sort of connects with me in ways that the definitions of moral distress does not is this idea about moral drift. And I think it's so powerful because that's what I was feeling. I think when I look back and try to prepare this talk and think about what resonates, the idea about moral drift. And moral drift is just imperceptible breaches that were rationalized as reasonable under constraints, which means that, you know, the lesser of two evils, two smaller evils, then grows into the lesser of two greater evils. And we don't recognize it until something terrible happens. And then we look back and go, our standards. And I realized I was doing that from like people I was sending home who normally be admitted, people who needed an ICU bed who go into the floor, you know, blankets that were not being given out to people. And why I think we need to address moral injury and moral distress is that not just this idea about moral drift and where we go and how we move, our standards move and move and move, but we don't realize we're moving. Is the fact that unaddressed, our moral distress lingers. And this idea about moral residue, that these unresolved situations of moral distress sort of accumulate. And that next thing you know, it's like we end up having a new normal. We don't go back to where it was. You know, so we become angrier, become more hopeless, become less empowered. We feel powerlessness. We become more isolated. And they talk about this idea about a crescendo effect. That was sort of because now we're up here, you know, because we haven't sort of talked about it, we haven't dealt with it, we haven't addressed it as an individual, interpersonal, or organizational level, you know, it pushes people out the door. You know, and there's literature that sort of hints at the fact that how moral residue and crescendo effect has led to attrition in the healthcare workforce. So, you know, what do I got to sort of leave you with is I have a couple of ideas. So it's like before self-care, there's self-awareness. We have to surface what many of us experience and feel, but don't recognize and talk about. It's really hard to talk about this, you know, and I got to tell you, stories are an amazing platform. But trying to figure out how we're thinking, like talking to others. I think this morning some people mentioned the fact that just talking about it and having to try to put language to it, that sort of understanding is like a pathway into themselves, as well as it is to communicate to others. You know, there's sort of empirical work about sort of the value of telling stories and sharing stories, and there's sort of a sense of self-satisfaction in our work, and it leads to an open-mindedness and an open-endedness and a way to deal with uncertainty. And we realize that the thing about stories and the things that we tell each other and the stories we tell about our own experiences is that it's flexible and it's malleable and it moves with the situations that we have. And the more we get comfortable talking about these things, the more I think we get to the core issues at play. So what surfaced today, you know, from our conversations, I'll give you a couple of feedback, a couple of thoughts from you all that I got. So one was that this is incredible. You know, first and foremost, this is an incredible group. I was just honored, and it was a privilege to sort of be with you all today. Everyone was so game and very open in a way that I haven't really experienced before. It usually takes a little while for people to sort of break down a little bit and sort of open up, and everyone, for the most part, was there, and people were writing, and I know that's not easy, and I'm very grateful. Secondly, I was very touched by the fact that things we talk about in this talk, people came up with the value of emotions and how sometimes talking about this, writing about this makes us emotional, makes us challenging, makes us feel good. The fact that people can be probed, you know, and the conversations that we needed to have, we're having, that we had to create spaces, these bursts to flatten the hierarchy. And you have to create these spaces. It's about the space. And it's the people who are filling that space. And it can't be a reactionary thing to sort of disasters and quandary. It has to become part of the culture. We can have these conversations. And people were open and listening and non-judgmental. And I think that was absolutely extraordinary. And I think what's important is how can you sort of continue this type of work after this. So we can be so overwhelmed by the big problems, big challenges, and there's certain things that I just am trying to wrap my hands around. And Dr. Miller and a few colleagues are trying to wrap. That's so hard to wrap your hands around. But I feel like there are certain things that we should try to not sort of flinch away from. You know, there are smaller things that we can, and it begins with giving a voice to the stakeholders and trying to establish that voice. Because what studies have shown is that in the few situations where we actually have some data on, like either moral distress consultation, or people who are doing some programs, either in family practice clinics, you know, in different environments, is like the power of giving voice. Power of giving a voice and giving people a platform to talk and speak. Secondly, an opportunity to bring people from different perspectives and different places into the same space to talk to each other. 3, it's really about establishing a culture where these type of discussions are valued and open, and not treated with judgment. I think that's the only way that people can actually help break down those barriers and really talk about the things that are important to them. And so, you know, I have to tell you that, you know, I battle with this. I battle with this idea about moral distress and moral injury. All I know is I feel lousy. You know, I'm going to leave here Sunday, and I'm going to fly back to Rhode Island, and I'm going to, hopefully, if all my connections make it, I'll be working my overnight shift. And so I'm not talking to you here as an expert. I'm talking to you as someone who's trying to deal with this and trying to work my way through this. And there are my good days and I have my bad days. And it got me on a better day. Might not think that way, but it's on a better day. And I just really want to encourage you all to think about moral distress in a way that's personal and important to you, and to make it meaningful to you, and to bring a voice to some of the challenges that we had that I thought was interesting today is we talked about solutions and next steps. It was a tender subject, and people were not as open. I thought that silence was really telling and really important. There's a lot that needs to be said. So thank you for the honor and the privilege of being here. I'm totally just, you know, this is a high point for me. And I wish you the best. Dr. Miller, I wish you the best. And I hope that we have a lot of work to be continued. And please, you know, this is references. I'll be more than happy to share those with you and Steve can. This is my contact information. If people want to reach out, I'm more than happy to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Brewer. Let's give one more hand of applause to him. I was privileged enough to go to the morning session and got a lot out of it, and thank you for doing that. It was great. And thanks for coming. If you're interested in continuing this conversation, President-elect Deb Broman would like to invite you to the Compassionate Communities Forum. I'd also like to thank the Vitality Steering Committee. Please stand if you're on the Physician Vitality Committee. Thank you. I have a few announcements before we adjourn here. We'd like to remind everyone that June 8th and 9th, Corey Feist, the CEO of Dr. Lorna Green Heroes Foundation, will be coming to talk about mental health stigma among physicians and how we can reduce it. We will have a keynote dinner, much like this, at the St. Luke's Anderson Center, followed by morning breakfast and workshop on the same topic. If you are in a position at your job to change policies around what kind of questions are asked on applications, credentialing forms, and the like, we really would encourage you to come to that workshop. On September 7th and 8th, we will continue this series with an appearance from Dr. Bill Daugherty, the co-founder of Braver Angels. This national nonpartisan organization helps people engage in dialogue with others who don't necessarily see eye to eye on important issues like abortion, gun control, school choice, and other hot button topics. Dr. Daugherty will talk about depolarizing conversations in healthcare. And the workshop will be specifically focused on improving your skills in the clinic. We also have a couple other events coming up. This summer, we are having our first night out with the Boise Hawks baseball team on August 5th. And our Go Wild at the Zoo Boise will be September 19th. So be sure to mark your calendars. And you can find more information on the back of your program or on our website. At this time, one more announcement. There's plenty of leftover food. There are to-go boxes. Please feel free to take some on your way out. And at this time, the floor is open for any member to bring any new business to our board. Okay. Seeing that there is no new business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, guys.